Hello, welcome. It's Thursday. That means we are live with another episode of Tomorrow. We're very excited to have a special guest, Anne Olson, who will be talking about policy with us here today. As always, we'll get started in just a few minutes. I strongly encourage you to use this time. If this is the first opportunity that you've had today or this afternoon to stand up and move away from your computer, please find your moment to do that now. It's also really important that you remember to drink water. If you have only had coffee or tea today, why don't you go grab some H2O? Your body will thank you, I guarantee it. As always, this session is being recorded and we will post it to the Remake Learning YouTube channel early next week. You can also use Twitter and Facebook to comment and ask questions, and we'll answer as time allows. And while we're waiting to get started, please visit remakelearning.org/join to review our network norms and values, since we don't go through them during our Thursday live streams. We'll just give everybody a few more seconds to slowly roll in. And I'm going to kick us off. Welcome again to another Thursday episode of Tomorrow. We're being joined with my fabulous co-host, the amazing Jason Swanson, and his colleague, Anne Olson from KnowledgeWorks today. They've been helping us shape how we think about the possibilities of what tomorrow may bring for teaching and learning. For folks less familiar with our work, Remake Learning is a network that ignites engaging, relevant, and equitable learning practices that support young people and educators and caregivers navigating rapid social and technological change. We know that no organization alone can do the work that is underway to transform teaching and learning. And as we focus on our next 5-year horizon, we remain committed to justice that will make learning a more equitable place for all teachers and learners to thrive, on the methods of the most engaging and relevant practices supported by learning science and cognitive development, as well as the thing that underlies all of it, which are the deep and caring relationships between and among us as educators, us as change makers, us as caregivers, us as learners, and with, of course, the young people that are at the very center of our work. This conversation is brought to you by Tomorrow, which is asking big questions around what tomorrow may bring, what we need to flourish in an era of unknown possibilities, and how we prepare children for what's next while staying timeless and grounded in teachings of icons like Fred Rogers. We hope you'll continue to join us every Thursday, typically at 2 p.m., but do watch for change times as we have conversations with folks from all over the world. And more stories, more events, especially coming up in October, and more conversations, professional learning opportunities as we explore the future of learning. Please connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you ever want to learn more about Remake Learning, you can contact our info@ account on the screen and set up time to chat one-on-one with me. I'm Ani Martinez. I'm the Field Director for Remake Learning. And it is my sincere pleasure to welcome Anne Olson. Anne, hi, welcome to the stream.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So it's amazing to have had the opportunity to curate this series in partnership with Jason. And not too long ago, Catherine Prince, your colleague, had one of my favorite chats that we've had so far on this series. And so so our audience will be a little familiar with KnowledgeWorks at this point, but tell us more about you and your role with the organization.
Sure. So my name is Anne Olson, and I serve as Director of State Advocacy at KnowledgeWorks. So as you all may remember, if you were a part of the conversation with Catherine, KnowledgeWorks is a national nonprofit organization that focuses in multiple areas on how we can create the future of learning together, which I think is a really great tagline for the organization. And a lot of that work is driven by Jason and Catherine's team, the Future Foresight team. But another part of how we can think about creating the future of learning together is to think about how we align systems. And that for our organization comes from the ground up and from the top down. So we have a team that focuses on professional development and actual implementation work in districts that are interested in specifically aligning their work to personalized and competency-based education. And then my team, which is the policy and advocacy team, looks at what state and federal policies need to shift in order to enable that transformation to happen on the ground. And we also have a research team that is focused not only on evaluating the programs that and the implementation work that our On the Schools team is doing, but also helping guide us in thinking about what research and development is there in the education field right now. So my position sits within the policy team specifically, and I come from a background of state advocacy work in Texas before coming to KnowledgeWorks. So I am happy to have this conversation because I think what we're talking about today is right up my alley.
That's probably one of the best descriptions I've ever heard about our organization. And Cheryl Dewig, our friend from New Zealand, once gave probably my favorite description of both us and Ani and Remake Learning, and that we are a group of positive social deviants.
Yes.
So, I think both organizations are really interesting because we're engaged in essentially large-scale social change in one way or the other. But we're here to talk about the future and policy and advocacy. And we've been really, really fortunate to have a lot of deep discussions with practitioners and innovators and sort of thinking about innovation from the ground up. And you're our first guest with the policy lens. So I'm really curious to get your thoughts around the role or roles that policy plays in shaping futures for learning.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of directions that answer could go.
Sure.
And so as I am giving my answer, please know that there are about 500 other directions we could also take this. I think from a state perspective, there is a lot of opportunity for visioning and enabling to happen, and guiding to some degree. Right now, a lot of the policies that are in place, either legislatively and or through regulation at the department level or through a state board of education, are pretty rigid. And that I think is because we are operating still in a model of education that is meant to be sort of systemic and in a box and more about the Industrial Revolution. But as we are moving into a new era, Jason, like you all talk about in your forecasts, and the world around us is becoming more personalized. I think there is a lot of opportunity for the state to really lead efforts to support and enable transformational, personalized work on the ground. Meaning, how can states guide districts and support districts in coming up with new and innovative ways of engaging in professional development for educators? And in what ways can the state support community needs rather than assuming what communities need, to make sure that what they are asking and holding accountable districts and schools to do is actually relevant to what's going on in that community.
So what I'm hearing is, within the context of education policymaking, it sounds like there's the beginning of a shift right now from moving from sort of these rigid structures to more of a flexible approach that can maybe support and possibly enable these things at scale. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think there is. I think I would say for a lot of states, the desire is there. And from a policy perspective, the waivers are there, the grant programs are there. I think what will take longer is changing what has been the culture of education policy for 100 years, and truly shifting that culture and the surrounding policies around it to make sure that what is enabled right now through waiver programs or small grant programs can actually be scaled out and can actually, so we're not enabling the 5 districts that are funded through the grant program. We are enabling and guiding and supporting all of the districts in the state to be innovative in a way that works for them.
Yeah. And what's resonating with me around our present moment and what I'm hearing you say, Anne, too, is how much it matters, for better or worse, for a district to have an identity in the public sphere, not just within their own community, but within their region and throughout the country, which is one of the reasons why you see so many schools in the Pittsburgh region in particular who have become very adept at their social media prowess, their marketability. And I see pros and cons to that, but I would imagine that kind of work is also tied up in policy and in the future of being a school.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this shifts a little bit from what we're talking about now, but I think one of the powers of allowing a community to have that voice within a state is that then you create a larger network of districts that are able to talk back and forth to one another. And we talk about in Anya, a resource that I chatted to you to stick up at some point, and this might be a perfect point to do it. We talk about a concept called shared ownership, looking at, from a state perspective, what needs to shift to really elevate the voices of educators on the ground and make sure that there is a shared accountability and ownership between the state and communities and districts on the ground. And I think one of the big pieces of that is the state being a liaison, perhaps, instead of a gatekeeper for what is innovative and personalized on the ground. Real quick, I do want to mention this because I think it's an interesting piece that I have just recently parsed out for myself. So much of what's innovative in the classroom can happen at a classroom level, right? So personalization can happen in one classroom in a school, maybe next door to a classroom that doesn't do it as well or does it in a completely different way. What I think is really interesting about competency-based education specifically, which is one type of systems level change that KnowledgeWorks focuses on, is that you can't do that and sustain it classroom by classroom. There has to be a system level buy-in. And this moves a little bit into the advocacy piece as well, where once you enable and empower communities, be it classroom community, school community, or district community, to really parse out what it is that they want to do that's innovative, you have to then have that through line back up to the state so that the state can help empower systemically this new type of learning. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's you can't. There are still pieces of change and innovation in education that I believe you can't have truly sustain themselves without state buy-in. However, I think there is a relationship that we're seeing states move more and more towards that allows for that to be more reactive to what communities need rather than dictated so much by what the state wants to see.
I love that idea, and I totally agree about there are certain pieces or facets of innovating the system that can't exist in pilots or isolation. Certainly assessment and credentialing pilots. And when you said like move the system, I think the challenge is even bigger, right? Because you're moving systems, right? Yeah. Because if you think about all the other systems that are adjacent just to K-12 and all the problem statements that come along with trying to do something at scale like that, you know, the first thing you hear usually is like, well, what about post-secondary options? How is this going to limit folks? So I have to move the K-12 system. I've got to get buy-in from post-secondary. I've got to get buy-in from the employment sector to see these things and say, I know what a graduate has or doesn't have from an academic standpoint. So I love that framing, and just would add that I think it's even more of a challenge in some instances.
Yeah. Kind of makes you need to take a deep breath for a minute.
Oh, for sure. But I also think it's one of the most powerful levers of change, right? Because once you can say we're going to drive towards this more competency-based model of assessment, that forces a lot of other changes, kind of under the hood innovations from, how a classroom is managed and what time looks like to what supports look like, and sort of all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. But I was also really curious about something you said around shared accountability, because I love that concept and sort of co-created accountability systems. So with what your team is thinking about in terms of shared accountability, are there any like exemplars out there that you could point to, or bright spots of saying, like, if maybe this isn't the example, like they're kind of charging towards this or knocking on the door of this?
Yeah. I think, though I am not extremely familiar with sort of the details of this programming, New Hampshire has stuck with finding a way to engage schools with performance assessments for, I believe this last year was maybe their third year doing it, and they have worked at scaling that out. And I think what has come with that is an understanding that performance assessments might look a little different depending on the school. Also knowing that you kind of have to have comparability right now with standardized assessments, but it's allowed for a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more trust from the state to the local level to engage students in meaningful assessments that allow for a little more creativity than just a standardized test, and allow for a little more personalization. And again, I'm sorry, I don't know a lot of the details in what that looks like. But for those of you that are on the chat, shoot me your email and I'm happy to find out and get it to you if you're interested. I think I'm now lost my train of thought on what your original question is. I think there are a lot of states that are looking at stakeholder engagement differently, which I think is a precursor to maybe some of this larger change. And so they are including new to them stakeholders in, for instance, I believe it's Rhode Island in their ESSA plan had a stakeholder engagement committee that was designed to help with the school improvement process in their plan. North Dakota has a student advisory group, as well as a parent advisory group, as well as an educator and administrator advisory group. So I think what we're seeing now is the start of new types of stakeholder engagement that can lead to more of those assessment and innovation and what we think about in education is more traditional accountability changes. That said, there are still a lot of limitations because at the federal level, you still have to have this end of year assessment. So there is that caveat, but states are figuring it out as best they can.
And I think too that this concept's really exciting in that, as we move down that path towards an effective shared accountability model, I think that starts to open the doors to say, if this is working, could this form the skeleton to thinking differently in some ways about more equitable funding structures?
Yes, absolutely.
So I get really excited when I think about the possibilities for that particular angle of your work.
I think just real quick on that, I think what is interesting and something that will always have to stay top of mind for everyone working in policy are the continued power structures that exist. So for instance, if I'm thinking back to some of these stakeholder engagement groups, I don't mean to say there is a judgment on any of these groups at this point, but if you don't engage stakeholders in a way where they they are allowed to say to you as the state, this is what we believe you're doing wrong. This is what needs to change. In the end, the shared accountability really only goes about halfway. And it could be that even the opportunities for more equitable funding and equitable structures are not there because they are not truly seen as equals in conversations. And that is a big risk consistently with policy, consistently.
For sure. Absolutely. I mean, it can further ingrain a lot of the issues that the schools or the system's dealing with now. Yet on the total positive end, if it's done well, you clarify your vision because you have deep community input. It's not just made in a vacuum, potentially by people that are not in touch with the end user, the student. In that way too, in clarifying vision, you get really super real about the value proposition of that schooling system to that community, which then allows you to open up the doors to say, what processes do we have in place that are aligned with these value systems and sort of this value proposition? So it creates the occasion for lasting change, hopefully.
Ani, I would love to know, I'm familiar somewhat with Remake Learning, but I think that is exactly what Remake Learning does so well as a network, is sort of creating this opportunity for equal leveling in conversation and bringing out the voices that have not maybe traditionally been heard, but are a very important part of the education system. And I'd love to just have you share a little bit more about the influence you have seen in the region and maybe even at the state level when it comes to that systems level sort of policy change and or this idea of shared accountability.
Thanks, Anne. It's a great experiment. Remake Learning, Chicago Learning Exchange, the Providence After School Network, and many others who are really thinking about how networks create and undergird systems that are based in this ecological model. You hear places like that referred to as ecosystems, and it takes us full circle back to that introduction language around relationships. And that so often, and even things that I'm hearing you say and talk about around stakeholder engagement, hierarchies within stakeholder engagement, people who aren't even brought into stakeholder groups because they're not seen as full people or full stakeholders, however you want to frame it. Networks like Remake Learning seek to change that and really put people in relationship with one another by adding the capacity, the human capacity, to facilitate and broker those exchanges. And that's very precious work because it can be very challenging to measure it numerically, although qualitatively we can see it, in many different avenues and in many different spaces. But those numbers really do matter, and so we need to, figure out the hard math of the network effect beyond social network analysis. I think too, when it comes to policy, scalability, equity, and safety, I think that networks can contribute a great deal with the right research prowess behind them to really reconsider what scale even means. And historically, and Jason, you've heard me say this many times, we think of scale as replication, duplication, and maximization of sameness. But what is interesting to me and other network facilitators that I work with, what does scale look like and safety look like and accountability look like when it's not replicating sameness, but it's about the interconnectivity, the relationships between and among them? I don't know if that fully answered your question, but as a network facilitator, that's how I see the work.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great point about traditionally, I think if you're looking at it from a policy perspective, the idea is scaling sameness and the quantitative data that comes with being evidence-based as the baseline for scaling sameness. And I think what we're going to start seeing is more and more of what you're talking about, where it is, there is more opportunity for making it your own, whatever it is.
And feels like it's lockstep in that that transition from kind of rigid structures for policy to more flexible environments that should allow for growth and scale.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're in a roundabout way talking about with the idea of ecosystems or networks and community ownership is really looking at a different lens towards advocacy. So I'm really curious, because I know through the years you've really thought critically and really innovatively about your own advocacy model and practice. But just to get your thoughts on really not just the role of policy, but the role of advocacy in advancing equitable futures for learning, and sort of how you personally pursue your own practice around advocacy.
I love that question. So there are a few different ways that I have been thinking about advocacy lately. One of them is taking more of an activist mindset. And that's something I'd love to explore with the two of you all in a bit, because I've been thinking a lot about the nuances of advocacy versus activism, or are they really the same thing? And I'd love to explore that a little bit. So set that aside for a minute. I think there is this more, what I would call traditional, though I don't mean rigid when I say traditional. The way that people often think of advocacy is with a policy lens, right? So you are advocating for policy change. I think that's extremely important and is something that we are continually forming and reforming at KnowledgeWorks. Then I also think there is just this idea of having an advocate's mindset. And that is something that I have really been in my own life focused on lately, as I am stuck in my house by myself for 24 hours a day, given COVID. What are the ways in which I can engage an advocate mindset via outlets like social media, just in conversation on Zoom with my parents in a different state? What are the ways that I can advocate for what I believe in and what I am thinking about and what I want to explore for the future, just in my circles? And that has been personally a really important, I want to say it's a shift, because I think I've always been that way, but a really important recognition for me lately, that I think translates into the advocacy world, especially right now for educators and for students who have to advocate for their needs in a way that is very abrupt, in a way that is requires them to day to day think about what it is that they need, and then longer term think about what it is that they need. So I say that to say there's I think about advocacy in a lot of different realms of life. But I think with policy advocacy specifically, there are a few tried and true, a few very, what's old is new again kind of strategies that I think are really important. One of which is coalition building and is organizing. I actually just read an article last week in Social Work magazine written by 3 University of Pittsburgh professors, so shout out to Pitt, about organizing and the importance of using consensus building and organizing as a facilitation tool to really help people recognize that they do have power to make their voices heard at a policy level in and among groups that maybe often are marginalized and oppressed by those that are already in power and making decisions for them. And I think that is, though that is not a new technique, I think given the patterns that we're seeing in the world right now around activism, I think that's going to become, again, an extremely powerful tool that maybe we've moved away from a little bit, especially, again, at the state level and local level types of policy advocacy. Ani, I just saw you go off mute, so I'm going to pause because I could talk the rest of the hour about this, but
I love that we're creating new social mores and cues around muting and unmuting. And I was just going to note, as a facilitator, I couldn't agree more about consensus building. And one of the things that colleagues of mine and I have often tinkered with around creating and professionalizing the art of being a facilitator is that it's like a twin of consensus building and analysis, and really doing the strong work of observation and deep listening as the facilitator, and the deep importance of the art of note taking. Yeah. And that documentation can't be emphasized enough. And so I'm talking to all the young organizers and all the young facilitators out there, like, get your pen, get your phone. Like, that is the future that is the past, present, and future of change making. And whatever kind of documentation, if that's writing, if that's like making music about it afterwards, I do still recommend good old fashioned notes because they really help people circle around shared accountability, shared ownership, right?
Yep. And I think there is often an overlooked power in, the power of really good facilitation is often overlooked. So again, for those of you who are young organizers out there, your role is extremely important in helping to cull through and analyze everything that you're hearing, all of the different perspectives that are coming to the table, and finding that consensus that you can move forward with. I think a lot of times policy advocacy can be seen as wanting incremental change. And I think that's true to some extent, because there are oftentimes very specific things you can come to consensus on in this moment that you can move forward in, whereas you still have a bigger picture in mind that not everyone's on the same page about. I could debate myself all day long about whether or not that's the right way to approach change. But I do think in the end, you are still making an important change that then you can build from. And again, I think that's where the documentation, the note taking, the power of a facilitator can come in to help remind the group what was talked about before. And maybe the next time you meet, you get to come to a consensus on something you addressed before and couldn't at that point.
Yeah, being the living memory, right? Sometimes the secret of Remake success is, in all honesty, having the person to buy the bagels, send the emails, take the notes, send the follow-up, right?
Take care of each other. Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it is if I'm going to be asked to share with you what's important to me, I want to know that I'm being taken care of in that. And the role of a convener, a facilitator, and that is hugely important because it also builds that level of trust that shows me that I'm being taken care of and that my input is valuable.
When we're going down a deep tangent, Jason, I'm sorry, I know we have so much to talk about, but what if, and I know KnowledgeWorks is very much embedded in research and the realities, but what if schools reimagined, at least in part, guidance counselors as community organizers, as facilitators, right? What if that was a whole new role that operated in partnership with teachers and guidance counselors?
What if part of learning was being organized as a school community and finding ways to make small or large community change from that through the guidance of a social worker or a guidance counselor that becomes a lead facilitator in that? How cool would that be?
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. And so it's interesting to think about sort of the through line of this conversation too, and reflecting on what you just said about incremental change and advocacy, right? But if we start with that first shift, so rigid to flexible, we look at the power to build networks, both as an advocacy tool and around coming to a consensus. And really this idea of what's old is new again, right? And I've some questions I want to ask you on that in just a second. But if we look at how all, these three trend lines might collide, right? I'm left with the impression that even though that change that we see now might be incremental, and I'm not dismissing incremental change as being less than valuable. It's totally valuable. But if we look at how these things might play out, you might find yourself in a place where the change that you're looking for and affecting is actually wholly transformational, if we're making certain assumptions about sort of the changes we've been talking about over the last 30 minutes. And then, back to this idea of coalition building and some, these classic tools that have been tried and true. Might they actually be more powerful now than they were even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, as so much of our lives, including, civic dissent, has gone digital, right? And that idea that I can build a coalition and be in the streets, or even just engage in something like a letter writing campaign, would actually have a stronger effect with almost less energy spent now, because policymakers just expect the protest movement to get 1,000 likes and not have to actually confront that reality.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And I think there are two thoughts that I want to express through that. One, I think I also feel like there's this blurring of marketing and advocacy right now. To that point, sort of, you have the soundbite, you have the clip, you have the thing that from a corporate perspective, for instance, you see a lot of corporations explicitly expressing support for Black Lives Matter movement. That is an important advocacy tool. It is also, to some degree, a marketing campaign. And I think you could argue it could all be profit motive. And so I think from a technology perspective, it's a lot easier to share out these little, to some extent, sort of PR marketing kind of pieces, but also very values-oriented advocacy sound bites that, to your point, do mean that it is less cumbersome on your end to civically participate than it may have been in past, and or it's enabled you in a way that you maybe haven't felt comfortable in the past, or you haven't live in a small town and a lot of this movement's happening in the big city. Technology enables you to be a part of that movement. I think the other piece of why I would agree with you that coalition building has become even more powerful over the last 10 to 15 years is that I think as politics have become more and more polarized, if you don't have a coalition built to make policy change, it's really easy to conflate politics with policy and to say, well, as a decision maker, you are a part of a group that is perceived to be more left or right, so I don't have to listen to you, as opposed to building a concerted coalition where maybe you have a faith-based organization on the same page with a grassroots civil rights organization on the same page with a professional association, and suddenly policymakers have to say, well, wait a minute, I don't know where I'm supposed to fit in this, so I actually have to listen to you. And again, I sort of want to caveat this with my mindset mostly comes at the state level. I honestly don't know if I think that's true at the federal level right now. But I think there is still so much change that we can affect at the state level and the local level that I do still have that hope for those kinds of sort of curious relationships to form around specific issues of policy change and mean a lot more than they have in the past.
And I think certainly the growing recognition among stakeholders that, in the areas that we're hoping to affect change, there's such a great deal of intersectionality that, within that growing recognition that, hey, all this stuff is kind of connected. There's a lot of interesting coalitions being formed around that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point in thinking about the work of KnowledgeWorks, because we have so much of our focus and our mission is on the academic side of education, but we constantly have conversations about the recognition that there is so much more than academics that goes into the health and well-being of any kiddo in our system, in our school system. And so it's those, going back, Ani, to what you were saying, it's those relationships that you're able to form where we leave off in our expertise. We know we can engage in someone who maybe has more of the SEL focus or has a true social justice lens to a different part of education than what we do, and build a coalition in that way, not only to make policy change, but also just to progress our work, knowing that nothing happens in a silo.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality is, right, I dropped it in our chat, but no one group, no one organization could do it alone, nor should they, right? So I want to go back just a little bit to talking about advocacy for sort of advancing futures for learning, and sort of to go about really to ask, how you engage in the actual advocacy as it relates to ed policy.
One of the interesting ways that KnowledgeWorks has gone about it is by convening decision makers, policy makers, and have them think about the future of learning together. And it's amazing to me, shouldn't be as amazing or surprising as it is, but it is amazing and surprising to me that the very people who are making these high-level decisions oftentimes are just not given the space to think about that stuff. And so it is, though a lot of my team's work is just providing space for people to think differently, it's really interesting to see that a lot of times they come around to the exact policy changes that we want to see, but they come around to it on their own. So as we're asking them to think about, what is your vision for, if you are thinking as a state leader, what is your vision for teaching and learning in your state? What do you want students to value? What do you value? What do you think your communities value? And how might you get there? Almost always they come around to new accountability systems and personalized competency-based learning. And that's interesting to me because it's not necessarily planned that way, but I think it's important that we've seen that. Related, it's been interesting in those same groups to continually realize how important storytelling is to just educate policymakers about what the future of education could be like, or what bright spots there are now, so that it's not such a mystery. And that's sort of maybe the next level after talking with policymakers and letting them explore the future is, okay, so it's not such a scary thing. Look at what's happening now in your state. And a lot of times they aren't familiar, by no fault of their own, they aren't familiar with some of the great work that's happening on the ground in their state. And I think that is where we are upping our efforts to help liaise and tell those stories to policymakers about the bright spots now, because that really is an advocate's responsibility. Because you only know what you know, and if you are a decision maker that's asked to vote on a specific bill about innovative learning and you don't understand how it connects to your district or your community, you may vote no. And if advocates are there to tell the story of why that bill is important to them, and if organizations like KnowledgeWorks can help tell those stories and share those stories with policymakers, then you start to shift that line of thinking. so that hopefully you can, at the end of the day, change the policy that you need to change.
And I think this is a really helpful point to push to the front, because often, we're trained to think of storytelling as a narrative arc. It has characters, and you can write it down on a piece of paper, and you certainly can. But we also just had a full conversation around the new digital activism, time, space, attention, marketability. And I think it's really important as change agents and as educators broadly that we really start to advance and make our storytelling impact much more relevant. And I don't think that we're doing nearly enough to stay in the contemporary sphere of the methods of how stories are told, coupled with the very old practice that stories aren't always written. And the social stories that we weave are oral and will always be so. And so there's a practice that the Remake Learning crew has done from time to time where we just get ourselves in a room and we draw the walls with all the districts and all of the out of school time organizations that are in our directory. And we ask ourselves, close your phone, close your laptop. Who can you name at each of these organizations? And that's part of the stories that we tell. It's so much because you're not in your phone when you're just on the fly with a funder, with someone who's making policy. And you say, oh, did you know that this organization does this, this, and this, right? It's really important to attune your brain to be able to do that as an activist.
Yeah. And I think advocacy and activism, if one looks at them a little bit differently, share that in that it is about connecting dots and connecting people. And you can have the stories all day long, but if the right people aren't hearing them to help make the decisions, then what good is that story to have, to hold instead of to share,
And
so, go ahead, Annie.
No, Jason, please.
Well, I was curious to know, so we've talked about how advocacy can be used to advance futures, right, and change. Where might have you seen it possibly fall short?
I think this is a hard question to answer. I think that there are still so many power structures at play that keep, though the policy may be there, the power structures within the larger system keep true change from happening on the ground. And that is honestly beyond just not changing the policy that you'd like to change. I think that is an ongoing challenge where policy falls short because you only have a piece of paper until you help implement it. And so I think that as an overall sort of overarching where policy falls short is continually going to be a problem. I think we are in a place where rather than there being sort of so many missed opportunities for policy change, we are on the forefront and we're almost to the place where there could be a lot of missed opportunities, right? So a lot of states have, again, these waiver programs, these grant programs that allow for flexibility in education implementation that can be more nimble. And it's even changed now even more because of COVID, but where you can allow for this flexibility. For instance, a great example is, I think every state decided not to have a standardized assessment last year. So we're right on the cusp of what do we do with that? And what do we do now that all of these districts and schools have been forced into so much change given the health pandemic? It's in the next 6 months to a year that I think we will see what states are embracing policy change in a way that keeps systems nimble for the future, and what states want to just go back to what we had before. And I think that's where we'll start to see opportunities and missed opportunities taken advantage of from a policy perspective.
And that comes right back to what we were talking about storytelling. Like, this is the time to be talking about, hey, we piloted this, hear it right from the kids, right? This is what they want. This is what our communities want. And, bringing that to the fore and really thinking critically about the mean and mode for which we tell those stories, per your point, Ani, I think is going to be critically important.
And the fact that educators have very swiftly, more than many other fields, became codified as essential care workers within the last few weeks, and that people finally understand how systems deep education impacts your life, even if you don't have someone who is under the age of 24 in your life, presently, actively in your home. The care of youth and children in our society impacts everyone. And I'm not talking in a like children are the future kind of way, though they are, and we should care. But on the day-to-day logistics, it has been a tremendous wave of awareness for the public. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
And so, thinking about, now that we've sort of looked at things that don't work so much, if we were able to alleviate those things, and what would some of those preferred futures look like as a result of taking care of some of those pain points and some of those inefficiencies and inequities in the system?
Yeah. I think at the core of it, the preferred future that is just and equitable to me is based in trust. And I think it is, we have a long way to go, but it is based in trust. Almost, I think of it as like a through line of trust, right? Like, so the teacher trusts the student, the administrator trusts the teacher, the school board trusts the administration. So it's this build of trust that exists throughout an entire system. I think the decisions that could be made if we all trusted each other to do what's right for kiddos in our community could be a part of what alleviates a lot of equity issues. Because what comes with that is a full shift in power, is a recognition that communities and districts that are now seen as at risk are recognized from a strengths-based perspective, because we have changed the way that we look at accountability and what kids are held accountable to and what is relevant in one community over another. And I think we get there by making sure that the future is human-centered, right? Jason knows this, I'm a social worker by training. So the human-centered piece is incredibly important to me. And I think there are ways to integrate the technology piece into the human-centered design. But if you have a system that values a student as a whole human and not just a learner even, then again, that starts to create new levels of trust in what that student is able to do as an active participant in their education. And I think that's a huge part of, for instance, competency-based education. And if we could get there with the systems, then I think we would find sort of a back and forth growth of trust and growth together as a community. I love the way Education Reimagined frames it, and I wrote this down earlier. They say they envision an education system that celebrates the wonder, creativity, and endless imagination of every child. And I just love the way that that's phrased, especially with the word wonder, because I think that is such an incredible, all-encompassing term for how, if we built a system based on trust, you could captivate a child in their education. It's probably a bit of a woo-woo answer, but it's where I am right now.
It's not woo at all. I mean, it's not something that anyone lacks. It's innate to being a person, especially being a young person. And it's something that the Connected Learning Alliance has been exploring for 10 years now, is that when a student is motivated and connected to something that they're passionate about, we can call that wondrous about, then as long as access and guidance are supported or are in the same sphere, that trifecta doesn't feel like work at all. Someone will sit and do math problems and math equations all day long if it serves that passion, right?
Yeah. And I think it creates the conditions in the classroom that more fully mimic the real world.
Yeah.
With wonder and trust, you can, in very real ways, bring uncertainty into the classroom, because there's that through line of trust, and that you can fail openly, right? And that I just think that it more fully mirrors reality. And I want to just thank you for such a beautiful answer too.
Thanks. That's kind. I think so. One other thing I've been thinking about, and this goes back to what I mentioned before we started the stream about, like, what have I not thought about before that I really want for the future? And I really would love, big picture, for us to get to a place in the future where kids see the act of lifelong learning as normalized, right? Like there is this nearer term future where every kid enjoys lifelong learning and every kid is motivated to be a learner lifelong. But then there's the next iteration where it is normalized because the adults in kiddos' lives are lifelong learners, be it they're getting a GED right alongside a kiddo who is getting a high school diploma, or be it that they want to go back and learn a new certification. But that is normalized to the point where we don't even have to think of it as something to strive for the youth. That to me is the other piece I just have been pontificating about lately.
And that takes us directly into pathways and accessibility, right? Yeah, it's a wonderful thing to pursue a credential and a field of learning and content, and it would be an entire policy scope and exploration to really think about what divestment and disinvestment means from a current structure financially, and all sorts of power relationships on top of the cultural norming that it would take to get many of us into that place. And I think that would be a mountain in terms of trust building. Just to say you belong here. Not only do you belong here, but there is generational compensation that supports you that has been so intentionally disinvested from your family or your community for generations. Right?
Yeah, exactly. This has been fun.
You're welcome back anytime. And one thing in the future, a preferred future, I believe, for both Jason and I would be to have you back in conversation with young people.
I would love that.
So stay tuned. You might get a knock on your email come wintertime.
I'm there.
And as always, I want to say thank you, Anne, for sharing your expertise with us. There are so many links in the comments section. I strongly encourage you to take them, flag them, read them, please reshare them. And then I also want to, as always, thank you, Jason, for bringing in your amazing colleagues and your deep knowledge and expertise and your vast imagination for the future of this work. And of course, thank you for everyone who is listening here live with us and will be watching us later on YouTube. If you ever want to learn more about the campaign, please visit remakelearning.org/tomorrow. We will be having these conversations every Thursday now through October, though don't be surprised if we continue the format in other forms or fashion. Jason, I know, is very excited about this. If you ever want to learn more about Remake Learning, talk about networks for the improvement and advancement of teaching and learning, or just collective impact work and facilitation work in general, please get in touch with me. You can find my email address all over the Remake Learning website. Just look for my face. It's on many of the pages. And we're just going to circle back to gratitude and close us out for this Thursday edition of the Tomorrow campaign. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.